Hello, I'm Dr. David Boyd, and I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. Really delighted to be joining you today from the west coast of Canada for this webinar on corporate due diligence and human rights and climate change impacts, hosted by the British Institute for International and Comparative Law. Although it has been somewhat overshadowed by the COVID-19 pandemic in recent months, the stark reality is that we are living in an unprecedented global climate emergency. Levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are at their highest level in more than 3 million years, dating back to the Pliocene epoch, before Homo sapiens had even evolved. We have been very fortunate over the past 10,000 years of the Holocene to live in a stable climate, which has really enabled the emergence of agriculture, cities, and civilization. The climate emergency is having huge impacts all around the world today. These are no longer distant, unforeseeable, or future impacts. They are impacting, as I said, countries around the world today. Impacts including more frequent and severe storms and other extreme weather events, droughts, wildfires, floods, ocean acidification, the melting of glaciers and ice caps, increased incidence of water and vector-borne diseases, and many other impacts. And these biophysical impacts have impacts on human rights, on the rights to life, the right to health, the right to food, water, sanitation, the right to culture, the right to property, the right to development, and the right to a healthy environment. And I have witnessed some of these impacts firsthand in my role as the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. My first country mission was to Fiji, one of the small island states that really is at the front lines of climate change impacts. And I visited a small community called Vunidogoloa, one of the first communities in the world that had to be completely relocated because of the impacts of climate change. This tropical paradise, this small village located on the coast of one of the Fijian islands, was relocated because of rising sea levels, storm surges, and the salinization of their drinking water and agricultural lands. And although they only moved 3 kilometers inland, as a subsistence community dependent on the ocean, it has had profound impacts on many of their human rights. I also visited 2 small communities on the outskirts of the capital of Fiji, informal settlements that have arisen because of the impact of Tropical Cyclone Winston on Fiji in 2016. One of the strongest storms to ever reach land in the southern hemisphere. Tropical Cyclone Winston killed more than 60 people in Fiji, left thousands of people homeless, destroyed homes, destroyed crops, destroyed infrastructure. And some of those homeless people have moved to these informal settlements on the outskirts of Suva, where they are living in really subpar housing, very ramshackle conditions. The government of Fiji, to its credit, has managed to provide them with access to safe drinking water and electricity, but they do not have access to adequate sanitation. And as a result, both of these communities are subject to regular flooding. One is beside a river, the other beside the ocean. And when the floods happen, then the fecal matter washes out of the pit toilets and contaminates the lands, the foods, and the waters of these communities, resulting in some of the world's highest levels of cholera, a deadly waterborne disease. I also visited Norway, and while I was in Norway, I went north of the Arctic Circle to meet with the Sami indigenous people. And the Sami people, reindeer herding is at the heart of their culture, the heart of their economy, and yet changes in precipitation have really had a dire impact on reindeer herding. Reindeer during the winter use their hoofs to scrape away the snow so that they can access the lichens that give them sustenance. But in northern Norway in recent years, for the first time in memory, they have had a lot of rainfall during the winter, which results in ice. And the reindeer's hooves simply cannot get through the ice to get at their food. So the reindeer herders, the Sami people, are having to supplement the reindeer during the winter, which is logistically challenging, dangerous, and also very, very difficult. So these are just a couple of examples of the actual impacts that climate change is having today on people around the world. And these are really the tip of the iceberg. Countries got together in 1992 and negotiated the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which they committed to avoiding dangerous anthropogenic interference with the Earth's climate system. And what have we done as a society in the intervening 28 years? Well, greenhouse gas emissions globally have risen 60% since 1992. The use of fossil fuels constituted 80% of the global energy system in 1992. In 2019, the use of fossil fuels still constituted 80% of the global energy system. So clearly the pace of change has not been adequate to address the challenge of climate change. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a landmark report outlining what would be necessary in order for states to comply with their obligations under the 2015 Paris Agreement on Climate Change, where states committed to limit the increase in global average temperatures to 2 degrees Celsius at the most, but ideally to keep the increase below 1.5 degrees. Of course, we're already at 1.1 degrees of increased warming over pre-industrial times. And what the IPCC concluded, sorry for these acronyms, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concluded that we need rapid, far-reaching, and transformative changes in all aspects of society in order to meet the challenge of climate change. So in a report that I presented to the United Nations General Assembly last fall, I outlined the obligations of states and the responsibilities of businesses vis-a-vis climate change, of course referring to due diligence obligations for both states and business. The current landscape in terms of due diligence requirements is not adequate to the magnitude of the climate challenge. We have the UN guiding principles, we have the OECD guidelines, but these are voluntary tools with a lot of uncertainty in their application. We have some sectoral regulations that have emerged in recent years, such as the European Union's timber regulation and the European Union's conflict minerals regulation, but these are also not sufficient. In order to meet the climate change challenge, I believe that we need regulations that are legally binding, that apply to all businesses in all sectors of the economy in all states. So it's encouraging to see the French law on the corporate duty of vigilance. It's encouraging to see other European nations moving in that direction, and it's really encouraging to see the discussions now taking place at the European Union about a European Union-wide directive that would make due diligence mandatory. All of these are critical steps towards legal systems in place. And if we think about the impacts of climate change and where we need to go, what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said, then some of the recommendations that I made in my report last fall become very clear. It is impossible for me to conceive of a situation in which a state or a business could fulfill its due diligence obligations in approving or proposing a new mine for thermal coal or a new coal-fired power plant, in light of the fact that the world already has more fossil fuel reserves than it can possibly burn and stay within the 1.5 or 2 degree targets set forth in the Paris Agreement. It is impossible for me to understand how a business or a government can authorize or propose additional exploration for more coal, for more oil, or for more natural gas. If we can't burn what we have, then it makes no sense to explore for more. And so I think that this due diligence trend, this due diligence requirement in legislation is actually entirely consistent with what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has called for, which is rapid, far-reaching, and transformative change. Corporations and businesses have to be part of the solution, and this is one of the ways that they can be. So I hope that you have really fruitful discussions throughout the rest of this webinar and through this series of webinars, and I hope all of you will contribute to protecting the people we love and the place that we call home from the impacts of climate change. Thank you very much.